present here today and online to this wonderful presentation. During our 150th anniversary this year, Pilgrim is focusing each month on a different ministry, and this month is the immigration ministry of this church. And we're delighted to have a special speaker this morning with us from the Young Center, Kelly Almanac-Cribbs, co-director of the Technical Assistance Program at the Young Center. The Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights protects and advances the rights and best interests of immigrant children. So without further ado, thanks for being here, Kelly.
Thank you, Deb. It's a pleasure to be here. Bear with me 1 second as I get the mic in place. All right, we're good on sound still? Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here this morning. Thank you for those of you who are in attendance virtually. As Sally said, my name is Kelly Cribbs. I'm an attorney with the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, where I've worked for the past 8 years and focused on advocacy on behalf of unaccompanied immigrant children. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that population today. It really is a niche population within the broader migrant population that y'all may be working on behalf of or learning about, but a particularly, I think, compelling, at times vulnerable, but also resilient and strong population that I'm honored to have a chance to highlight with you all today. So, and hopefully you can see behind me, I'm going to chat a little bit about what it means to be an unaccompanied immigrant child. So that is actually a formal legal term of art. It's defined by a statute, and it refers specifically to any young person or child under the age of 18 who arrives in the United States without lawful immigration status and without a parent or legal guardian with them. This is a population that we've seen incredible increases in recent years of kids coming to the United States. Back when I started my work at the Young Center in 2016, there were about 59,000 unaccompanied kids that arrived and were placed into federal custody. Last year, in fiscal year 2023, we saw 119,000. So really, we've seen a lot of growth, unfortunately, in kids feeling like they need to flee their country in order to be safe, and they come here to the United States. The population is overwhelmingly adolescents. About 3/4 are 14 or older. But that said, we do still work at the Young Center with kids who are younger than 14, and even sometimes infants and toddlers. And you may wonder, how does an infant or a toddler get here without a parent or legal guardian? Well, they may come with another family member, maybe an adult sibling, an auntie or uncle who has raised them, a grandparent. But if it's not a parent or legal guardian, our government at the border will separate that child from their adult caregiver, even if it's an adult who has raised them their entire life and they may think of as a parent. So that's how kids as young as 6 months or 18 months wind up in federal custody.
Yeah. What is the justification for that policy? Do you know?
I mean, the main justification is that the statutory definition of an unaccompanied child is a child who arrives without a parent or a legal guardian, an individual who has the legal authority to make decisions about the health and welfare of the child. And I think a lot of it comes from just like from fear that, it could be like a trafficking situation, or it could be somebody with bad intentions, which of course does happen from time to time, but really, in our experience, it's pretty easy to ascertain whether the person, if you're interviewing them in person and there with them in person, you can tell pretty quickly whether or not this is somebody the child trusts and is like their lifelong caregiver, or whether it's a trafficker. Yes, Sally.
It would be helpful if you repeated questions.
Oh, yes, that's right. I will repeat questions going forward. I was asked what was the justification for the separation of kids from non-parent caregivers, and that last one. In terms of the gender breakdown of unaccompanied kids, it's about 60% male, 40% female. And in terms of their nation of origin, the majority of the unaccompanied immigrant kids who come to the United States are coming from Central American countries and Mexico, about 87% in the past year. That still leaves 13% coming from other countries around the world. At the Young Center, we work with kids. We saw an influx of kids from Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul, but we've worked with kids from Russia, from India, from China, from Ghana, from Togo, from all over the world, Brazil. Yes, you have another question?
Any from Ukraine or West Bank in recent years, since
because of the conflict, right? The question was whether or not we worked with kids from Ukraine or the West Bank. A few kids from Ukraine, and I think I can think of like one family, Palestinian family that we worked with recently. So really in those instances, it has to be that those families are able to travel to our southern border. Which I'll talk a little bit more about the journey in a minute, but so it's pretty rare, but it has happened from time to time. Certainly global conflict plays a huge part in the trends in terms of national origin and who we see arriving at our southern border. So why do they come? Lots of different reasons. I can't emphasize enough that though I'm talking generally about this population, it's a group of human beings, right? So the experiences are so varied, so nuanced, so impacted by different circumstances that there is no single narrative of an unaccompanied immigrant child. But that said, the kids that we work with, these are some of the main reasons why they have fled their country of origin. Domestic abuse or instability is a big reason. Kids who maybe have experienced abuse in the household or maybe have lost parents and don't have any formal caregivers in their country of origin. Gang and cartel violence is a huge push factor, especially from the Central American countries that have some of the highest crime rates and murder rates in the world. Especially with our adolescent boys, we see a lot of young men who are facing the possibility of being forced into a gang, almost akin to child soldiers, right? And so many do make the decision to flee the country rather than have to participate in those criminal organizations. We see kids fleeing for persecution that they suffered on account of their religious affiliation, their ethnic affiliation, or even their political persuasion as young people become more involved in politics and government. Certainly kids who are targeted because of their LGBTQ status. We've worked with a number of kids who identify as gay, bisexual, trans, who experience extraordinary, terrible treatment in their country of origin and came here seeking a better life. And then there are some kids that we work with who may not have experienced these violent push factors and who are coming here because of economic migration. That does happen from time to time as well. They're hoping to be able to work, to provide for their families, which, who can't relate to that? Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about the journey. So for the majority of the unaccompanied kids that we work with that are coming from Central America and Mexico, most of them are traveling north through Mexico and often doing so on cargo trains, right? Some of you may have heard about these cargo trains that start at the border with Guatemala, travel all the way north to the border with southern border with the United States. They're colloquially known as La Bestia or the Beast, right? They're trains that are huge, travel up to 60 miles an hour, and migrants by the thousands try to jump on them and ride them north rather than traveling by other means on foot or hitchhiking. Those should go without saying, it's extremely dangerous, right? To be jumping on and off moving trains. We've worked with lots of kids who've experienced violent incidents or witnessed violent incidents as people are trying to get on and off these trains. And the other thing is that, you know, it's very well known that these are the routes that migrants take, and various, you know, cartels, criminal organizations know that migrants are a vulnerable population, traveling from place to place, know where they can find them and know where they can be targeted, right? So we also see kids experiencing kidnappings or being, you know, held up at gunpoint and robbed of whatever few possessions they do have on the journey. So I can't overstate how dangerous it is for kids to be making this journey north. And I do want to take a minute and talk about the smaller portion, right, the 13% that come from elsewhere in the world, right? As I mentioned, various countries in Africa and Asia and South America. Often we see people traveling, sometimes by plane to South America, sometimes by cargo ship to South America, and then traveling by foot up from South America. I've worked with kids who come into Brazil or come into Ecuador, and then are making their way up to Central America. They have to pass through, some of you who are following this population may have heard of the Darien Gap, which is the densest jungle in the world. It's found on the border between Colombia and Panama. So you have thousands thousands and thousands of migrants making their way through that jungle, which is extremely dangerous for natural reasons, and again, still now because there are these known pathways, a place where migrants can be targeted. But I've worked with kids who've traveled for 6, 7, 8, 9 months up from South America to the border with Mexico, between the US and Mexico, kids who've lost family members on the journey, kids who thought they might lose their lives on the journey. It is a trauma in and of itself, the migration journey. And a lot of times in our work, we talk about the triple trauma paradigm that kids experience. Whatever it was that prompted them to flee is often some type of trauma, and then the journey itself. And then in a moment, I'll talk to what happens when they get here, which is often also a highly traumatic experience for these kids. As they make their way to the border, I like showing these pictures because the border experience can be very different for kids and adults depending on where they cross, right? In some places, the border crosses through urban areas. There's lots of, civilizations, buildings, population. And then for hundreds of miles elsewhere, it passes through rugged terrain, right? Deserts, mountains, rivers, ravines. And I've worked with kids with a variety of experiences in terms of how they crossed. Some may present at a port of entry, right? Walk across a bridge and say, I'm here, I want to seek asylum, and seek entry into the country that way. Others will try to cross between 2 ports of entry, right? And then perhaps be apprehended by Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, some point thereafter. Sometimes they're by themselves, sometimes they're led by a guide or a coyote that they or their family members may have paid to try to help them enter the United States. I've certainly, there are kids who, experience really dangerous situations, especially when they're crossing between 2 ports of entry, right, where they may find themselves in the desert without food or water. Maybe the coyote abandons them at some point, and they're actually, I definitely know of kids who are actually seeking out CBP, right, who are trying to be apprehended for fear of what might happen if they didn't come to government custody. And then once they are apprehended, there's the detention experience, right? And this is often, I think, one thing that's really difficult for a lot of the kids that we work with, because they often come here with this expectation about what they're gonna find in the United States, right? Kind of having this country up on a pedestal. If I can just get to the United States, I'll be safe, I'll be okay, everything will be much better than it was before. But then often what they experience when they get here doesn't really make them feel safe, right? It doesn't really make them feel that much better, at least at first, right? So when kids are apprehended, it's typically by CBP along the border, and they're placed initially in these CBP processing stations, which is what you see on the right here. It's like a big warehouse with like chain link fence walls to separate different groups of migrant populations. They're notoriously extremely cold. They call them la hielera, which is like the freezer. They have lights on 24 hours a day. Kids are typically sleeping like on these concrete floors underneath those like aluminum foil blankets that they give marathon runners at the end of a marathon race. And they have limited access to, food, hygiene, things like that. Once they are identified as children, they are only supposed to be in these processing stations for 3 days, for 72 hours, before they are transferred to more kid-friendly environments, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. We have seen, especially in the summer when migration trends tend to increase, that often there are real challenges in getting kids out of these processing stations that quickly. And a few years back, you might have even seen in the news, there was like, a really terrible situation where kids were languishing in these processing centers for weeks at a time. And they are just not appropriate for children. So that's their first experience with apprehension in the United States. And then they are typically transferred to facilities that are operated by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR. And for those of you that do refugee resettlement work, you may be familiar with that agency name. That agency handles the resettlement of refugees from other countries to the United States, but it also provides for the care and custody of unaccompanied immigrant children who arrive to the US and are transferred out of the CBP stations to what are more developmentally appropriate facilities for kids. And in terms of what the facilities look like, it really kind of runs the gamut. Some of them may have 15 or 20 beds, right? Be relatively small facilities. Might look like this house that I put a picture of on here. Like there's one on the south side of Chicago that looks exactly like that you would walk by and never know it was a detention center for immigrant kids. And then other ones might be huge. The largest one was one down in Texas called Casa Padre that has 1,500 beds. It used to be a Walmart, and they cleared it out and just loaded it up with bunk beds. So there's also different types of facilities for kids who may have different needs or different past experiences. There's what they call staff secure facilities, which is where they typically place most commonly boys who may have had prior engagement with a criminal system either in their country of origin or in the United States. It may have been a boy who disclosed that he was involved in a gang, and even if he came here fleeing that gang involvement, that might lead to him being placed in a more secure facility. There are residential treatment centers for kids with heightened mental health needs. I mean, and I'll tell you that many of these children have heightened mental health needs, right, in light of the various traumas that we've discussed already here today. And then there are foster care programs as well. There's transitional foster care, which is supposed to be short-term, 30 or 60 days. And then there's longer-term foster care, which can actually go on for years if kids have no one else to care for them. And I will say one way in which the immigration system is somewhat benevolent towards immigrant kids is that kids don't have to remain in custody while their immigration case is pending, right? So when they come into custody, the government will open a legal case against them, a deportation case, and then they'll have court proceedings that could last for years. But they don't have to stay in custody during the duration of that time. They can be released from these facilities to family members if they have them in the United States. And the reality is that most of them do have family in the United States. Many are coming to reunify with parents, in fact. So there's a vetting process that an adult has to go through if they want to sponsor an unaccompanied immigrant child out of federal custody. But the majority of kids, thankfully, are released from these types of facilities within about 30 days to a family member that then can care for them, and they can go to school, and they can, live in the community while their immigration case is pending. Those aren't the kids that my organization typically works with. We are more commonly working with kids who may not be able to be released from custody quickly. Maybe that's because they don't have any family here, or they have heightened needs, whether it be a medical need, a disability, mental health needs, pregnant and parenting teens, things that from the government's perspective complicate their release, and they want to make sure that the release is going to be a safe one and that the child will be well cared for. So sometimes, we're often working with kids who are in custody for months, or I have worked with kids who were bounced around from a bunch of these different facilities over the course of years. The longest one being a young man I worked with who came into custody when he was 11 and wasn't released to his aunt until he was 15. And I just can't emphasize enough how harmful that is for a kid to grow up separated from family in a highly restrictive environment where you can't even get a hug. They have rules about physical contact and things like that. So, so while these facilities are certainly better designed to meet the needs of kids, and they're operated by nonprofit organizations for the most part that really are vested in the well-being of kids, but they're in a system that is not always recognizing the unique needs and strengths of immigrant kids, and in my experience, prolonged detention that kids experience, that kids undergo in these shelters can be really detrimental to their well-being. Okay, do you have a question?
You might be getting to this.
Yeah.
But what happens when they age out?
Oh, great question. I hadn't built that in, but I'm happy to answer the question about what happens when kids age out when they turn 18. A little bit of good news on that front. It used to be the case that when kids turned 18, if they didn't have a family member that they could be released to, they were transferred to adult ICE detention. which is essentially county jail. And they would be picked up by ICE on their 18th birthday and shackled at the wrists and ankles and treated like a common criminal and taken to jail. It was horrific, and we did so much advocacy at the Young Center, along with other partner organizations like the National Immigrant Justice Center, NIJC, around trying to prevent that from ever happening. Fortunately, a couple of years ago, maybe more than that now, NIJC brought a class action lawsuit on behalf of kids who are aging out and prevailed in a settlement such that now that almost never happens. Kids are rarely taken to adult detention when they turn 18, and they can often be released to maybe adult caregivers who weren't able to complete the vetting process, or to different transitional housing programs that are available for young people. And this is a good time, I'm glad you asked this question, because this is a good time for me to put in a plug for two organizations in the Chicagoland area who do this incredible work of providing housing and case management and a community to kids aging out of ORR custody. There's one in Des Plaines called the Viator House of Hospitality, and one on the south side in Hyde Park called the Bethany House of Hospitality. Viator House works with young men. Bethany House works with young women. I'm actually on the board of trustees for Viator House. They both are incredible organizations, faith-based organizations that invite community partnerships from other organizations of faith to support the young men and women living in those houses. I cannot say enough about the mountains that they move on behalf of the young people in those programs. So happy to chat more about that afterwards if y'all are interested in learning more about how to support those efforts. But they really are unique efforts. There's not a lot of programming like that, but that's a great place where when kids are aging out, if they don't have anywhere to go, they can go to one of those programs. Now, when kids get out of detention, right, they still have another issue, right? So these are kind of the two big buckets of legal issues that kids face. These are the two big questions that they have when they come into federal custody. When can I get out, and can I stay here permanently, right? So that custody piece, that when can I get out, is kind of the first piece we talked about, where they're in these facilities, they may have sponsors that they can be released to. There is a legal obligation for the government to place them in the least restrictive setting that is in their best interest. So if they can be released to the community, they are supposed to be. That decision is not made by any court, by an immigration court or any other court. It's a decision made by agency officials within the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So that's one big legal issue that they face. And then the second one is their immigration case, right? The government, as I mentioned, when they're apprehended, opens up a removal proceeding, a deportation proceeding against the kids automatically. And then they have to be able to, if they want to remain here, put forth a claim for immigration status. They have to be able to show either to an immigration court or perhaps to an asylum officer that they have a right under the immigration laws that are in place to remain permanently in the United States. And there's a few different ways that they might be able to do that. I'm not going to dive too deeply here into the legal nitty-gritty of the different types of immigration cases that kids may have, but these are the main pathways towards legal permanent residency and ultimately citizenship that kids tend to explore if they have the assistance of counsel, right? Asylum is the big one. Many kids are coming here fleeing persecution in their home country. The one thing I want to note about asylum is that, you know, first of all, it's a complicated legal standard. It's always evolving, right, with changes in administration, with new court opinions coming down. And it's not the case that just because someone suffered violence in their home country that they're going to win an asylum case. They have to show that they have a well-founded fear of persecution in their country of origin on account of, because of their membership in one of the 5 protected classes: race, national origin, religion, political opinion, or particular social group, which is the most complex. Lots of things fall under particular social group. That's the one that the courts are kind of parsing the most often. But for example, a particular social group could be kids with disabilities or kids who identify as LGBTQ, right? But so it's not just that it's not enough to just show that they suffered violence in the home country. It has to be that they can demonstrate that it's because of their membership in one of those protected classes that they suffered that violence, and then maybe they can win the right to stay here. The other three bullet points here are different types of visas that kids might be eligible for. One is if they've been abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent in their country of origin. Another is if they are trafficking victims, if they were trafficked to the United States. Either, of course, there's people here trafficking. I think a lot of times people are thinking about sex trafficking, but actually labor trafficking is much more common. We see that quite frequently with the kids that we work with. And then if they were a victim of crime while they're in the United States, which does happen. I've worked with kids who have been victims of crime while they're in government facilities. That may open doorways and pathways to legal permanent residency as well. And I just want to acknowledge that there are very few accommodations for children in immigration proceedings. There is no right to a court-appointed attorney, right? That is a constitutional right that applies to our criminal system. It does not apply to the immigration courts. You have a right to show up with an attorney, but the government is not going to provide one for you. So every single kid who's taken into custody has to deal with court proceedings and has to find an attorney to help them navigate that system if they have any hope of navigating it successfully, right? So that's why there's a lot of organizations, nonprofits who are doing the work to try and connect with those kids and provide kids with those services, but the need for those services far outpaces the supply of immigration legal aid organizations and immigration attorneys, especially right now with the trends we've seen in recent years. I saw a statistic the other day from an organization that does a lot of data tracking around immigration court proceedings. And a few years ago, it was the case that 60% of people showing up in immigration court were doing so with an attorney, and last year it was 30%. And I see this every day in my work, where part of what I'm doing is trying to connect certain kids to immigration attorneys. And I know a lot of people in this world. I have a vast network, and it's still extremely challenging for me to be able to connect a kid with an attorney. So imagine for kids who are navigating this on their own, or with the assistance of family members who are also themselves recently arrived immigrants, right? May have their own court proceedings. It's really a insurmountable task in some cases. They are also fighting for their immigration case in an adversarial setting, right? Like when we go to court with kids, it's a courtroom with a judge up on the dais and an attorney for the government whose job it is to, explore whether this kid should be deported, right? And so, I mean, it's a very formal setting, and one that many kids find extremely intimidating. Even if we know we're going for a hearing where it's not going to be the hearing where they make a decision, right? Maybe it's just kind of a check-in, like a status check. Kids, and you can explain that to them and try to put their mind at ease about what's going to happen that day, but their anxiety is palpable whenever they have to step into this setting and confront the fact that our government is saying they don't have a right to be here, and it's on them to prove otherwise. They are held, for the most part, to the same standards of proof and the same procedures as adults are in immigration court proceedings. There are very few accommodations that recognize the obvious reality that kids are distinct from adults, right, and are going to engage in a formal court system in very different ways than an adult would. And if they lose their case, there is really nothing in the law that requires a judge or an asylum officer or another decision maker to ask, can this child be safely returned to their country of origin before they enter that deportation order? There's really no obligation. There are judges who will exercise their discretion to try to explore those things, and then there are judges who will not exercise their discretion that way, and who will order a kid deported back to their country of origin without knowing who will receive them, who will care for them, will they face threats from their community when they're returned. I included this slide because this is a picture that a kid that we worked with at the Young Center drew of his court experience, right? That's him in the little witness box there, and his perception of the judge sitting up on the dais. And as you can see, it was a scary experience for him. And the thing that, they say a picture speaks 1,000 words, and I think that's why I like to include this in my presentation. I'm going to take just 2 minutes. I'm going to wrap up here in a second and answer questions. I want to tell you guys a little bit about the Young Center's Child Advocate Program, which is our largest and most well-known program at the Young Center, where we work with kids who are in these ORR facilities, these juvenile immigration detention centers around the country. We serve, it's kind of a unique role. We don't, though I'm a lawyer, we don't serve as the direct representative in the immigration court proceedings. So we're not filing the asylum applications or the visa applications. We serve as the independent advocate for the best interests of the child. So if you're familiar with family law or child welfare law, you may have heard of the term of a guardian ad litem. So that's kind of what we are for kids in the immigration setting. So we are working with kids with the assistance of trained bilingual volunteers. We have a huge volunteer corps. And we go into the facilities, meet with kids on a weekly basis. We play Jenga, we draw, we listen to music, we engage with them in a natural, organic fashion, learn their stories at a pace they're comfortable sharing. And when we learn about what they've experienced and what they want for their future, then we advocate for what is in their best interest on matters such as when they can be released from custody, to whom. We collaborate with their immigration attorneys in their immigration cases. And the goal is to try and make the immigration system more child-friendly. The U.S. immigration system really does very little to recognize that children are different from adults. In virtually all other domestic court systems, if a judge is making a decision about a child, they use this best interests of the child standard. I see a lot of heads nodding, right? Like folks have heard of that. And there are really very few instances in the immigration system where a decision maker is required to think about what is in the best interests of this child. So the Young Center's mission is to change that, is to make sure that every decision maker is asking what is necessary to ensure this child's safety, to give weight to their wishes about what they want for themselves, to ensure their connection to family, to culture, to recognize their identity and make sure that they're connected with the services that they need to thrive. We are typically appointed when kids are in custody, and we work with them until they are released, and then for a transitional period as they're released to the community. We want to make sure that that transition goes well, they're connected to support services, but it's actually these days pretty rare that we are able to continue working with kids through the resolution of their immigration case, because that takes literally years. The average asylum case right now is taking 5 to 6 years to be adjudicated. So,
how many years?
5 to 6 years.
5 to 6.
Yeah, for an asylum case these days. And this is my last slide here. Just folks often want to know, oh my God, okay, now what can I do about this? Now, once they are educated about this population, and so that's obviously the first step here, like staying informed about what is happening in the immigration world is a really important first step in taking action. It's also a really hard one. If you feel like it's hard to stay on top of like what immigration law and policy is, don't beat yourself up, because I feel that way too. It is constantly changing. It has become such a political football in recent years, and obviously we see huge shifts in policies and practice from White House administration to White House administration. So it is hard to stay informed, but it's an important part of becoming an advocate on behalf of the community. I always encourage folks who ask, how can I help, to get involved in fundraisers. I know maybe it doesn't sound super fun, but I'm telling you, money is what organizations doing the work need, right? Folks are often like, where can I donate this or donate that? And it's often hard to manage those types of donations, but fundraising is always a welcome way to support the organizations who are doing the work in the trenches. Also, a lot of these organizations are frequently seeking volunteers, especially if you are bilingual. As I mentioned earlier, every child advocate at the Young Center is working in tandem with a volunteer who is actually the one who goes into these facilities. There's more than a dozen of them in the Chicagoland area alone, and meets with children and learns their story, and then partners with the attorney or social worker that they're supervised by in developing that best interest advocacy strategy. And then there's ways to get involved politically, right? I'm frequently contacting my representatives in Congress about various matters of immigration policy. It's actually easier and easier to do that these days, as lots of organizations can like set up ways where you just type in a few, your address, and then they have like a predetermined message for you to send, but which may seem like, if it's not personal, does it matter? Yes, it matters. Like when representatives hear from their constituents, it matters. And then finally, it goes without saying, voting and helping to get out the votes is a huge, because immigration has become, unfortunately, such a political football, who is in the White House matters so profoundly to the safety and well-being of, certainly of this population, but of the broader migrant population as well. So I can't stress enough how much what happens in November is going to profoundly impact the kids that we work with in ways that make me really scared, frankly. So get out that vote. I'm going to pause right there. That's the extent of my presentation. I always throw in my contact information in case anybody wants to follow up with more questions about anything that I've said that you don't feel comfortable doing in this setting, but I can also stick around for a little bit and take any questions that folks may have. Wait, you have a microphone, Sally.
Well, on average, how many children is the Young Center handling? Is the wrong word, but
Appointed to, yeah, working with.
At any given time?
We, it's a great question because it's not the majority. As I said, we work principally with the kids who are stuck in custody for a longer time, and we are typically right now under the work that we do appointing to about 1,500 kids a year. So that's across 9 offices, and our child advocate program team has a staff of about 100, and we're taking on 1,500 cases per year.
Heavy caseload.
I mean, it feels that way. It does feel like a heavy caseload.
No, I should have asked my mother because she actually had a month ago, a profound case dealing with this woman from Mexico, from the state of Mexico, who was playing cards balance. Mom, do you want to tell them?
Well, it's not necessarily on point to our discussion today. This was an adult who was seeking refugee status, but I do think it is notable that I presume you're probably seeing an increase in people from Mexico seeking asylum status. I was surprised. I expected that I was going to go in and work with someone from Venezuela, and I ended up working with a woman from Guerrero who had pretty profound concerns.
Yeah, I mean, at the Young Center, we actually, the overwhelming majority of the kids that we work with are from Guatemala and Honduras. We do definitely still work with kids from Mexico, and El Salvador is the other big one. But it's overwhelmingly Guatemala and Honduras. And I think, perfectly understandable to raise the experience of an adult migrant and the challenges they face in seeking safety in the United States. I think one thing I would add to the discussion is that so often when talking about immigration issues, you hear people say, look, I don't have any problem with migrants. I just want them to come here legally, right? Just do it the right way. And I think what is so misunderstood in that point of view is that there really isn't a legal pathway other than the one that people are accessing by trying to apply for asylum, right? Like, asylum, first of all, is a legal right enshrined in U.S. federal law and international treaties that we have signed, whereby anybody at the border or in the country, regardless of whether they entered with permission or not, has a legal right to seek the ability to stay here on account of persecution in their country of origin. So first of all, that is the legal way. And second of all, it's not like, people ask, somebody has a family member who's a U.S. citizen, can they come here? Maybe, but for many of these folks, that process takes 2 decades, right, to petition on behalf of a family member. We don't really have a meaningful worker program as this country did back in the 50s and 60s, right? Like a way for folks to apply and come work for a number of years and go home. I've actually, I've worked with many families who that's what they want. They don't necessarily want to stay here permanently. They want to come and work for a period of time and return to their country of origin. But there's not really a way to do that. So when people say just, get in line and do it the right way, I'm always like, can you please direct me to the line? Because I don't know where it is, and this is my, my job. So it's just one thing I would add about the adult migrant experience as well. Other questions?
I have a question about helping, I think everyone's heart's touched and wants to help. And the bilingual requirement is
It's tough.
a big hurdle.
Totally.
And I'm wondering just if you've seen in other organizations that might be a place to press in or to start if we want to be helping more than just with money.
Yeah. Honestly, if that's where folks' interests lie, I would strongly encourage you to connect with the Viator House or the Bethany House of Hospitality. They also need many, many volunteers who help with everything from tutoring kids with their homework to driving them from place to place to teaching them how to drive. There's to helping around the house and the kitchen. They need all sorts of volunteers, and they don't have a language requirement. So, and they are always looking for more community partners to work with to help in their efforts to educate and to train advocates, but also they need volunteers in those houses. So that is a definite place that if folks are interested, I'm happy to make connections there. I am well connected at both of those organizations as well. They're awesome. Yeah, Leslie. Get the mic.
I have a question about the history. How did the Young Center get started? And you're doing 1,500 now. When you started out, what were your numbers?
When the Young Center started out 20 years ago, it's actually our 20th anniversary in 2024, thank you. It was one woman, actually a former Oak Park resident, named Maria Waldron, who had a background in child welfare law, in like the domestic systems, and really not an immigration background. She had an experience where she went to immigration court and saw, at the time, this was back in 2004, there were only maybe 7,000 or 8,000 unaccompanied immigrant kids arriving at the border every year. But she saw those court proceedings, saw how kids were treated as adults, how few accommodations there were, how there was no requirement that the judge ask, what is in this child's best interest. And she was floored, shocked, appalled. And so she started out by, she got a grant from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, $60,000 grant. She was the only person at the organization, and she developed this program first here in Chicago, where at the time there was one single ORR facility for unaccompanied immigrant children. And she launched the program that way. She was probably serving maybe, 30 kids a year, 40 kids a year. And then over time, I think there are those in the immigration system who saw the value of this best interest advocacy and who were trying to expand kids' access to child advocates. And just over time, our work has grown and grown and grown. And, we've been able to expand all across the country. We are literally the only organization in the United States that serves as child advocate for unaccompanied immigrant kids in federal custody.
It's wonderful, but it's horrible.
I know. That summarizes the work in immigration. There's so many wonderful, beautiful things and so many horrible things as well.
I also have another question. What percentage of these kids are from indigenous peoples of the Americas, like the Quiche or the Hmong or the Lacandon, or even possibly Zapotec, or even from South America, like the Arahuacos, or like other people? Like, how many of this percentage of these kids are from indigenous peoples of the Americas?
Yeah, great question.
Guatemala having policy of genocide against its own Maya population very frequently, which the film El Norte is based off of. So I just wanted to know about that.
I don't have a precise number for you, but a significant amount. I mean, of the kids that we work with, I said the majority are from Guatemala and Honduras. I would go so far as to say the majority of the Guatemalan kids we work with are from indigenous communities in Guatemala and may have fled in part because of persecution they experienced on account of their membership in those indigenous communities, right? There's, as you mentioned, a long history of those populations experiencing violence at the hands of the Guatemalan government, and even though, and discrimination and ongoing harassment to this day. So while I was mentioning this before we started chatting here today, I speak Spanish, many of the staff speak Spanish, but many of the kids that we work with from Central America, Spanish is their second language, and maybe it's only so-so, right? So we're often working through indigenous language interpretation when serving the Central American kids and some of the Mexican kids as well that we work with. Folks may not know there are over 60 indigenous languages recognized by the Mexican government and somewhere around 35 or 40 recognized by the Guatemalan government.
I think Lauren had a question.
Oh,
Go ahead.
okay. I'm curious about the statistics on deportation of the asylum applicants, how many are granted versus how many are deported, and also if there's some sort of mechanism and advocacy or guardianship program for kids that are to be deported, whether there's anyone that works post-deportation or the process of resettling them back to their home.
Yeah, great question. I mean, in terms of statistics around deportation, one thing that's unfortunate, one of the many things that's unfortunate about the U.S. immigration system is so much of it can come down to where your case is being adjudicated. Like if you look at the grant rates in San Francisco and Chicago versus the grant rates in Harlingen and Dallas, they are night and day, right? So a lot of it is regional, unfortunately. And the other huge determining factor is whether or not you have a lawyer, right? When kids, there's some statistics out there that when kids have lawyers, they can win the right to stay here about 80% of the time. When they don't have lawyers, it's about 20% of the time.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, so it really is outcome determinative. And you had a second question.
About whether there's anyone
Helping with the repatriation.
Yeah.
Yes, there are organizations in the U.S. and in these countries of origin as well that we partner with who do help with repatriation. So there's an organization called KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. They have a safe repatriation and reintegration program where they partner with community-based organizations on the ground in many of the countries kids are returning to, so that if kids are going home, there's someone there to receive them, to help hopefully get them to someplace safe, or to connect with maybe supports that they do have in the country but might not be able to readily access. So there are some services that do that support. They are not U.S. government services, right? They are nonprofits who step in to fill that gap.
Yes, you spoke earlier about a couple of specific visas, the T visa and the U visa.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested about the U visa. Every now and then you read in the papers about some slaughterhouse who has been hiring these underage workers.
Yeah.
Can they be considered as victims of a crime? And are these companies ever treated as criminals?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my experience in those types of situations, and of course there's been a lot of reporting on kids who are labor trafficked, especially from the New York Times in recent months, that doesn't typically lead to a U visa because one of the requirements is that local law enforcement has to treat it as a crime, has to bring charges. The person who is the victim has to cooperate with the investigation and the prosecution of those crimes, and then local law enforcement has to certify that they did enough to cooperate. So there are a lot of barriers there, and just in terms of how law enforcement prioritizes certain crimes for prosecution over others, I haven't seen a lot of situations where the companies that are employing youth and putting them in dangerous circumstances are actually suffering criminal consequences for that. It could be in that situation there might be more of a trafficking claim for the young person, a labor trafficking claim, but again, that's really going to depend on the nuances of how they got that job and the extent to which it was under duress, which certainly happens a great deal. I think one thing that is a tricky nuance in understanding some of the stories around child labor trafficking is that many of these kids want to work, right? And many of these kids come from cultures where you start working to support your family at a very young age. And so there really can be kind of a cultural disconnect between that mindset and our mindset in the US, right? Where like kids are kids, they go to school, at least until they're 18, if not longer. Maybe they work, but it's only a little bit here and there, right? And many of these kids have had adult experience and a level of independence and self-sufficiency that, again, does not align with the average US adolescent experience. So I do think that's one of the trickier nuances of kids working is, you know, there's often a knee-jerk response that like, oh, that's bad. And I get that, especially when it's in unsafe conditions, right? But I also think we have to understand that there are different perspectives here, and that these young people, especially the teenagers, they have agency, and they have, you know, they have their own wishes, and we have to be mindful of what those are, and where can we strike the right balance between acknowledging those wishes and honoring them, but ensuring that if they are going to be working, that they're doing so safely and, you know, of their own volition. Yeah.
Willing victim.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think we should give Kelly a big round of applause. Thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah.
And thank you for speaking with us this morning.
My
It's been
pleasure.
very educational.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Here.